Saudi Arabia controls more than 15% of the world's oil supply. That's enough wealth to theoretically give every citizen nearly $300,000. Yet today, the nation is sliding toward debt, with reserves nearly halved over the last decade. How does a country that rich end up cash-strapped? And why does it still pour trillions into futuristic mega-projects while its foundation remains fragile? The answer is far more complex and more urgent than just oil dependency. The oil boom that built a kingdom. How does a country made up of empty desert just decades ago transform into one of the richest economies on Earth almost overnight? The answer lies in a single moment in the 1970s that rewired not only Saudi Arabia's economy, but also its entire society. During that decade, the global oil market convulsed. Western nations, reeling from supply cuts, found themselves desperate to import crude at any cost. Prices quadrupled, and countries like Saudi Arabia, sitting on colossal reserves, saw their revenues explode. In 1970, national income from oil stood at only about $4 billion. By the early 1980s, that number passed $100 billion. In one decade, the kingdom went from an austere desert state to a global heavyweight, simply because the world had no choice but to buy its oil. This tsunami of money changed the physical landscape almost beyond recognition. Villages built of mud brick and sparse settlements with unpaved roads were bulldozed and replaced with highways, airports, and sprawling cities. In places like Riyadh, towers sprouted in record time, funded entirely by easy oil wealth. Yet, while the cranes and concrete projects painted a picture of unstoppable progress, the underlying economy barely shifted. Almost no large-scale industries took root outside petroleum. Factories, advanced technology sectors, and even strong service industries were largely absent, because profits from crude exports made those ventures unnecessary. That dependence on a single commodity introduced what economists call path dependency. With oil paying for everything, schools, hospitals, roads, energy, even basic public salaries, the entire system evolved around global demand cycles rather than internal productivity. When times were good, every project seemed possible. When prices dropped, the state's central role meant every part of society felt the hit. Instead of diversification early on, the state doubled down, creating a loop where prosperity and crisis were dictated abroad rather than at home. One dramatic example of this logic came in agriculture. Keen to project an image of self-sufficiency, the government poured tens of billions into domestic farming projects in one of the driest regions in the world. At one point, it stepped in and purchased around $85 billion worth of farm output, much of it wheat, at artificially high prices. This was not because the harvest was efficient or globally competitive, but because leaders needed to preserve the appearance of independence. What looked like agriculture was, in reality, another oil-funded illusion sustained by the state's vast income. Even now, decades later, the balance sheet reflects this dependence. Roughly 80% of government revenue and over half of the national economy connect directly or indirectly back to oil. Every major project, subsidy, or public service is still anchored to the same single flow of money. The apparent stability masks a deep fragility. If demand shifts or prices fall, the entire economy finds itself exposed. The pressing question then becomes, how long can such a structure endure? Global trends toward renewable energy, electric vehicles, and climate-conscious policy are already reshaping energy markets. If the very product Saudi Arabia relies on loses dominance, much of its financial base may evaporate. The past shows how quickly prices can collapse, and each cycle leaves the scars of deficits, stalled projects, and mounting debt. The irony is that the oil boom built a kingdom in record time, but in doing so, it wired vulnerability into its foundation. Growth looked incredible on paper and in skyline photos, yet resilience was never baked into the system. The desert kingdom became wealthy almost by accident, and now every crack in the oil market feels like a tremor beneath its entire structure. This fragility sets the stage for the next layer of the story, because the concentration of wealth did not just shape the economy, it also funneled political power into the hands of a very small circle. A kingdom of wealth, but concentrated power. How is it possible that a royal family with an estimated collective fortune of over $1 trillion still governs a country that runs budget deficits year after year? The contradiction sits at the heart of Saudi Arabia's political and economic system. On paper, the nation possesses staggering personal wealth controlled by its rulers, yet the state itself often struggles to balance its books. The reason is rooted not simply in mismanagement, but in how power and money are intertwined within a single ruling circle. Saudi Arabia functions as an absolute monarchy. Unlike systems where political leaders are replaced through elections or where government offices are separated from personal holdings, here the ruling family directs both the state and the economy. Ministries, contracts, and strategic decisions often trace back to a narrow set of individuals. This arrangement allows for quick execution of national projects, but it also means the same network responsible for distributing oil revenues is the one that accumulates them. Transparency is limited, and accountability is shaped by loyalty rather than public oversight. This creates an unusual picture: vast national income flowing into a small concentration of hands, while the broader population depends heavily on state support for livelihoods. Around 70% of Saudi nationals hold government jobs. That figure contrasts with under 15% in the United States, where private companies dominate employment. In Saudi Arabia, the state payroll not only sustains household incomes, but also functions as a means of political stability. When people rely on government paychecks, dissent becomes riskier, and public approval is less about policy and more about financial security. Another layer of this arrangement lies in the source of government revenue. Approximately 3/4 of state income comes directly from oil sales. Because money flows from exports rather than broad-based taxation, leaders face less pressure to justify spending to citizens. In countries where taxes sustain budgets, people expect a degree of representation and oversight. In Saudi Arabia, oil covers the bill, so the monarchy can fund large-scale, prestige-driven ventures without the same level of domestic resistance. Projects like massive infrastructure expansions, luxury resorts, or futuristic urban plans can advance even if citizens question their relevance to everyday life. Public input remains minimal, while decision-making reflects royal priorities. Centralization brings both strengths and weaknesses. On one side, leaders can move quickly. If the monarchy decides to build a city in the desert or restructure public services, it can bypass bureaucratic layers that might otherwise slow progress. On the other side, there are almost no institutional checks. If a decision drains resources or creates long-term debt, there is no independent body to intervene. The same efficiency that speeds up progress also magnifies mistakes. Without diverse centers of power, miscalculations ripple through the entire system unchecked. The imbalance between concentrated wealth and widespread dependence becomes sharper when oil prices decline. When revenues fall, deficits appear, yet the population still expects salaries, subsidies, and services at the same levels as during times of abundance. Adjusting quickly is difficult because the entire structure is built on the assumption of steady oil inflows. In prosperous times, the concentration of power feels stable. In downturns, it exposes deep fragility. The capability to make rapid decisions turns into the temptation to paper over problems with new loans or further spending, rather than structural reforms. At its core, Saudi Arabia's pattern of wealth distribution is less a result of standard economic forces and more a product of political design. The fortunes of the kingdom are steered by the priorities of its rulers, creating a divide between the image of unlimited wealth and the reality of fiscal strain. This contradiction sets up the next moment of crisis. When oil prices crashed in 2014, the structure built on concentration of power and dependence on oil revenues was tested like never before, revealing how quickly cracks in the system could widen. When oil prices fall, the cracks appear. What happens when the single source of money that keeps the entire system running suddenly loses half of its value? That is exactly what Saudi Arabia faced in 2014, when oil prices collapsed almost overnight. Revenues were cut nearly in half, and a country that had once seemed immune to budget struggles suddenly reported a fiscal deficit of about 15% of GDP. For a state dependent on external demand for oil, there was no cushion to soften the blow. The consequences were immediate and exposed just how fragile the economic model had become. The sudden shortfall rippled through every corner of the system. Government reserves, once thought of as impenetrable, started to shrink at an alarming pace. Salaries were delayed, contractors were not paid on time, and regional projects ground to a halt. These were not isolated problems, but systemic shocks that showed what happens when a society operates as a function of foreign oil demand rather than its own productive capacity. The downturn revealed how deeply household incomes, state services, and investor confidence all depended on the price of a barrel set halfway around the world. The private sector offered little safety net. Unlike economies with diversified industries, Saudi Arabia had spent decades nurturing dependency. With 70% of citizens employed by the state and most major industries tied back to petroleum, there was no strong commercial base to counterbalance the fall in oil exports. Businesses struggled when government contracts slowed, and consumer demand fell when salaries became uncertain. The cycle became self-reinforcing. Less oil income meant fewer government payouts, which meant weaker domestic spending, which then further undermined growth. To understand the scale, consider the country's reserves. In the early 2010s, estimates placed these at around $750 billion. Within a few short years of low oil prices, that cushion shrank toward $400 billion. That reduction was not only a number on a balance sheet, it meant the government was forced to dip into savings at a pace that threatened long-term security. With every withdrawal, confidence that the state could manage prolonged downturns weakened. For a monarchy that builds legitimacy on the promise of stability and prosperity, the optics were almost as damaging as the economic pain. Debt markets also began to reflect this pressure. Credit default swap spreads, a measure of how expensive it is to insure against default, widened during the downturn. That made borrowing more costly for Saudi Arabia and signaled to investors that risk had increased. Higher borrowing costs meant that debt servicing itself became a growing expense. The very mechanism used to fund deficits, raising fresh loans, carried the seeds of future strain. Money that could have gone toward investment and diversification was redirected to interest payments and financial maintenance. Leaders pointed to new strategies, including economic diversification as the solution. But even those plans relied on the same volatile commodity. To invest in new industries, the state needed oil income to fund construction, incentives, and subsidies. When that income collapsed, so did the scale and pace of diversification. Paradoxically, moving away from oil required even more oil money at the start. Low prices made ambitious promises harder to keep, and many proposed projects were scaled down or postponed. The crash of 2014 was more than a temporary fiscal problem. It stripped away the illusion of endless protection from oil wealth and showed the structural weakness at the foundation. The economy was not built to withstand extended volatility, and citizens as well as foreign investors saw how fragile the model truly was. It demonstrated that Saudi Arabia's prosperity was far more precarious than skyscrapers and bold projects suggested. And with cracks now visible, attention turned to a sweeping plan called Vision 2030, a program that promised to reinvent the kingdom with futuristic cities and massive investment, while facing the same risky dependence that caused the crisis in the first place. Vision 2030: Dreams, Debt and Digital Gambles. Can trillion-dollar megaprojects save a state tied to a single resource, or will they accelerate the problems that dependence has already created? This is the question Saudi Arabia tries to answer through Vision 2030, a sweeping plan that aims to reshape almost every part of its economy and society. Announced as a turning point, it promises a future of advanced technology, new industries, and reduced reliance on oil. On the surface, the vision shows bold ambition. It speaks of futuristic cities promised to run on renewable energy, flying taxis crossing desert skylines, governance structured around artificial intelligence, and entire regions designed from scratch for a post-oil world. But the complexity lies just beneath the surface. Every one of these projects depends on heavy state funding, and that funding itself still comes largely from oil. For Vision 2030 to succeed in its most ambitious form, oil prices would need to hover above $90 per barrel. That dependency creates a contradiction. The country wants to build an economy separate from oil, but its only available means of financing relies on oil revenue remaining strong. When prices dip, spending power vanishes, which places the entire transformation in jeopardy. The most striking example of this tension can be seen in The Line. It was first presented as a groundbreaking urban design stretching 150 kilometers in length, housing millions in a zero-emission environment. Yet, as the financial weight of construction grew, the project was scaled back to just 2.5 kilometers. What is more, rather than shrinking costs, the reduced scope has ballooned its price tag, which analysts now estimate exceeds $1.5 trillion. This shift reflects the practical limitation of trying to fund the largest real estate experiment in human history through volatile oil income. Long-term projections make the challenge even clearer. Current fiscal patterns suggest that Saudi Arabia's reserves could be depleted by 2036 if expansive spending continues without substantial new revenue sources. The reserves, once considered an endless cushion, may not last another 2 decades under present conditions. That creates a countdown clock for the kingdom's ability to fund its grand ambitions without facing severe debt obligations. Unlike countries such as Norway, which built a sovereign wealth fund designed to safeguard against future uncertainty, Saudi Arabia has avoided putting strict protections around its reserves. The governance structure resists full transparency and prioritizes central control. That decision allows leaders to spend freely on prestige projects, but it also reduces the safeguards that might prevent financial vulnerability. Where Norway separates political leadership from the control of its oil fortune, Saudi Arabia unites them, increasing the risk that long-term stability gives way to short-term priorities. At the same time, the leadership has expanded its bets into less traditional arenas. Reports point to more than $60 billion allocated to cryptocurrencies and digital strategies. The idea is to diversify into high-growth, technologically advanced markets that sit outside of resource extraction. Partnerships with firms like DeFi Technologies illustrate an institutional push toward exposure in digital finance. These moves show willingness to experiment with disruptive sectors, yet they also involve heavy risk. Crypto remains volatile, regulatory outlooks are uncertain, and technological bets can fail quickly. Together, these developments reveal both innovation and danger. On one side, Vision 2030 channels a kind of forward-looking urgency, with megacities, renewable plans, and digital shifts signaling a recognition that oil will not last forever. On the other side, the funding model, debt dependence, and speculative investments tie the kingdom more tightly to the same fragilities it aims to escape. Trillions are being committed in the hope of building resilience, while the structural reforms that would reduce risk remain largely untouched. The result is a nation straddling two paths, one focused on prestige and spectacle, the other on financial sustainability. Which path dominates will shape not only Saudi Arabia's future, but also the stability of energy markets and global investments tied to its success. Saudi Arabia's real challenge is not simply financial. It lies in whether a system built almost entirely on oil can change without changing how power itself is organized. Economic transformation depends on structures of trust, accountability, and shared responsibility, things money alone cannot provide. $1 trillion can break ground on dazzling new cities, but no amount of construction extends the timeline if oil prices decline faster than projects can finish. The question is larger than budgets or reserves. It is about whether true diversification requires something beyond investment, a shift in political design that supports lasting economic strength.